You're listening to the Technology for Mindfulness podcast, episode 43, hosted by me, Robert Plotkin. Today I'm going to be speaking with Vincent Horn, the co-founder of Buddhist Geeks and Meditate.io. Vincent began teaching meditation in 2010 and has been called a power player of the mindfulness movement by Wired magazine, and was honored to be featured in Wired UK's Smart List, 50 People Who Will Change the World. You can find out more about Vincent Horn at BuddhistGeeks.org. We're extremely pleased to welcome Vincent Horn to the Technology for Mindfulness podcast. In the interview that you're about to hear with Vincent Horn, you'll hear Vincent talk about the value of social noting practice, and you'll actually get to hear the two of us engage in such a practice with each other. For today's tip, I'd like to suggest that you try out engaging in a personal or individual noting practice with your smartphone. So what that involves is interacting with your smartphone in any way that you like, really. It could be as simple as just picking up your phone, waking it up, and looking at the home screen, or it could be going onto social media, onto a website, reading or writing a text message, and then paying attention to whatever is in the forefront of your attention. It might be what you're seeing. It might be the audio that you're hearing. It might be feelings in your body, tension or your breath. And then you just put that to words. You might make it as simple as a single word, like if what's in the forefront of your attention is what you're seeing, you would just say seeing. And then in the next moment, you pay attention to what's at the forefront of your attention. And if it's what you're hearing, you would say hearing. You can go into more detail if you want, but I'd suggest that you keep it simple. And if you're wondering, why do this? It is a way of practicing paying attention to your experience and to identifying what your experience is. And many of us find that attaching a word to that experience helps clarify exactly what our current experience in the moment is. And one reason I found this kind of practice helpful in connection with use of my smartphone is that I, like so many of us, often find myself engaging with and interacting with my smartphone automatically, reflexively, and without really paying attention to what I'm actually doing. So by pausing and forcing yourself to not only pay attention to what your experience is, but attach a word to it, you can cultivate that ability to be aware of what you're doing and thereby create the opportunity to make more conscious decisions also about how and when and why you use technology. Give it a shot. I hope you find it helpful, and I hope you enjoy the upcoming interview with Vincent Horn. Hi, Vincent, and welcome to the Technology for Mindfulness podcast.
Thanks for having me, Robert.
You're welcome. I'm really glad to have you on here today. One of the reasons is that you have been in the, let's call it the online digital mindfulness world for a really long time. I mean, it's not an old field, but in internet time, you've been doing this for a long time, founding Buddhist Geeks and running many different projects through different iterations. I wonder if you can just start by telling people what got you into this, what motivated you to found Buddhist Geeks, and tell people a little bit about that organization for those people who don't already know about it.
Yeah, sure. So Buddhist Geeks is primarily known as a podcast. We launched in 2007, January 1st, right at the beginning of the sort of podcasting era. As you say, it's not a very old space, but it's amazing to me that's been well over a decade now. And we launched my co-founder Ryan Olke and I launched with an intention in mind to explore the way that Buddhism, the tradition, was intersecting with modernity. And over the years, that conversation has continued to evolve and change and developed in directions mostly that have to do with my own interests as the host. And how I got into it is that I was, prior to this, a computer engineering major, and started to come back around to meditation. I'd first been introduced to it as a teen and had gotten actually fairly deep into it without knowing that, and then looped back around to it in my late teens and became extremely serious about meditation and contemplative practice. And so I dropped out of my engineering program in order to become a full-time meditator slash waiter. And really, Buddhist Geeks was the attempt to try to integrate or bring those two halves back together to figure out and make sense of these two very different realities. My love for technology and this sort of burgeoning internet. I'm an elder millennial, so I kind of grew up with the internet, as all of us did. And then on the other hand, this contemplative practice in the depths of mind training and exploration of consciousness, and the way that those two, at least in the beginning, seemed diametrically opposed, if not completely different realities. Of course, as I did Buddhist Geeks and had all these conversations, I realized, of course, they weren't. And increasingly, I think the public conversation around it is leaning in that direction. So yeah, it's exciting to be at the forefront of a really emerging dialogue.
Yeah, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what at the time felt like technology, or your background in computer science and mindfulness were diametrically opposed, because that feeling within individuals and in the culture at large has changed and shifted over time. What was it at the time for you personally that felt like that was a strong tension that you wanted to address and to help other people address?
Yeah. So I think a lot of it went back to and goes back to generational differences. And the teachers that I was studying with in the Buddhist world, who are teaching insight meditation, mindfulness, they were all boomers, and their general orientation to technology at that time was to either ignore it or simply to kind of dismiss it in kind of a way that was clear to me that they didn't understand it in the way that I did and the way that my peers did. So, the kind of dharma and kind of training that I was receiving really didn't make sense to me in those terms. And so, for me, I sort of, the way I look at it now is, the teachers that I worked with, they had this great translation project of going to Asia, learning there and then bringing it back to the West. So they went from the East to the West, and they had to do a major translation project with respect to that, both linguistically, culturally, in terms of bringing it out of more patriarchal societies into more democratic societies, all of that. And the way that I look at the work that Buddhist Geeks has been about and what we're doing now is it's really a translation from the analog to the digital, which is, to me, it's equally, if not more profound of a shift in terms of paradigm. And so, that's kind of the tension that I felt, was this analog versus digital mindset. And, how do these deep, profound things that, I experienced on silent retreat practice and in the sort of Buddhist context translate into a high-speed, digital, highly relational, huge amount of input world? That was the tension.
Yeah, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what the dimensions of that translation may be. I mean, I think what I just heard you say was talking about some aspect of how many of our lived experiences involve interacting with digital technology, which involves speed and communicating with each other online, all these ways in which technology has become integrated into our lives. I've spoken to some other people on the podcast who've talked about translating mindfulness into the online world in the concrete way of delivering mindfulness education through the internet. And maybe there's more dimensions than that you're thinking of. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I see that as one big trend, the secularizing of mindfulness and the kind of attempt to um, communicate and educate in a different way. And that's certainly part of it. And it's kind of the move from more traditional practice cultures to more modern, and the transition from more analog ways of teaching and working with things to more digital. And I see that definitely as one of the dimensions of this translation project. I think the other dimension, which it's probably less clear, is the way that Buddhist mindfulness reflects back on modernity. So if we assume that these two, modernity and Buddhism, have something to offer one another, that they shine a light on each other, I think the light that Buddhism shines on modernity um, has been a little less clear than the way that modernity changes Buddhism. And part of the reason is modernity is such a huge and powerful force, and there's so many dimensions to modernity. I don't want to speak too broadly, but I mean, there's capitalism, there's there's all the digital technologies, and there's our governance and democracy, and there's all of these different powerful institutions and deeply embedded beliefs that we come up with as secular people. And where I think the translation project still has a lot of work to do is to sort of see, how do these ancient Buddhist approaches, what might they offer modernity that we're actually missing? Um, that's the part that I get kind of most curious about these days. And it's a big question.
Sure. I wonder if you can share, are there any examples in the work that you've done through Buddhist Geeks
Yeah.
of this kinds of translation of Buddhism into the modern world, either through some projects or ways that you teach or have interacted with people to help people understand both what you've done and maybe so they could benefit from it?
Yeah. So, one project that I see starting to actually catch hold and start to enter the mainstream dialogue now, that we were really exploring on Buddhist Geeks from day one, is the whole conversation about the difficult aspects of the contemplative journey, or the what one of my teachers called the dark night stages of practice.
Yes.
And the way that, when one gets into meditation in a kind of serious way, meaning, that it becomes part of one's life. It's like a serious part of one's life. And it starts to influence not just what we do in terms of our habits each day, like coming and sitting for a little while and then going to work and doing our thing, but it sort of becomes something that we're always considering, or we're coming back to again and again throughout our day, all the time. At that point, a lot of people start to experience very weird stuff. And sometimes they experience, their sense of self identity changing or even dissolving. Very difficult and painful emotions can surface: confusion, disorientation. It can feel like one's practice, where it was really good and easy before and providing all these amazing benefits, suddenly completely breaks down, and the mind is wandering as if like we're starting from day one. And for me, what I learned in going through the journey was that that is actually a stage of practice that's expected, if your attention gets honed enough and you become focused enough and paying attention consistently enough. That's supposed to happen. Your ego is supposed to dissolve. Your sense of identity is supposed to break down. And that's what these practices were originally designed to do. And now most people aren't doing enough meditation. They're not getting the dose high enough to experience those things, but it's not uncommon for people, even with low doses, micro doses of mindfulness, to start to experience these kinds of effects. And so that has been a deep conversation on the podcast. It's central to how I teach meditation. I sort of want to help people move through that phase and get to the other side, because there is another side, and on the other side, is actually really, really good for a while until it gets bad again. But that this is sort of starting to enter the mainstream dialogue in terms of a backlash to mindfulness. It's one of the backlashes that seems to be happening now. And so that's been a big project, is to help bring that into public awareness, because it's the ethical reason. One of my first teachers, Daniel Ingram, was a ER doctor, and he described this very much in medical terms. He said, if meditation, if you start taking the dose high enough, you're going to have these effects. Now, imagine if I were, a surgeon, and you came onto my operating table, and I made this huge incision right in the center of your chest, and then you got up and left right there. That's kind of what happens. That's what it's like when someone enters these disillusionment phases of practice, and then he said, imagine that we, released this medicine into the world as a doctor, release this, person into the world with this open incision without telling them what the side effects could be. That's the ethics of teaching mindfulness in the modern world, is that, there's an issue of, when it's framed as a kind of panacea, as this thing that's going to solve all your problems, or reduce depression, anxiety, etc. It can do those things, but it's not so reliable and consistent. And if someone really ups the dose, they're going to potentially find that their anxiety increases for a while, or actually are more depressed, because they're going through these really deep transformations in their own consciousness.
Beginning of that, you were saying you don't think that mindfulness in the modern world, or let's say in the West, is often being taught this way. And I certainly see mindfulness often being taught as just a way to make life easier, or to eliminate stress, or in general, only have immediate or fairly short-term positive effects. And as you said, it can have those effects, some of them for some people at some times, but that, tell me if I'm wrong, sounds like you're saying there's something unethical about selling mindfulness as if that's all there is to it, and not preparing people for the larger and longer term effects, particularly if you develop a deeper practice over time.
Yeah, which some percentage of people do, and I meet them because they end up finding their way to to trainings or programs or retreats that I'm part of, and they say, I say, how did you get into this mess? And they say, Headspace or Calm or whatever it is. And so I know there's a decent percentage of people that find their way into that.
Yeah, and I have seen some of this backlash in the last year, and of course, I think any kind of criticism that people have from their own experience or what they're seeing around them is really positive and healthy to have. But are you alluding to things where people are saying, I went to a meditation course and I experienced negative emotions, and therefore we should be wary of mindfulness?
No, it's much worse. It can be much worse than that. I mean, people actually, unfortunately, there's some sad stories of people who've recently committed suicide after retreats, and who have serious mental health breakdowns. And that's not new. Talking to my teachers, the people that have been leading retreats since like the 60s and 70s, that actually happens even when you have the container that acknowledges that it can happen, and you're totally supporting people. It still can happen. People can still kind of lose their shit a little bit when reality starts to kind of not appear as what we thought it was. That can scare people, or it can surface deep wounds or traumas that were present and held in the body, but that we didn't know were there, because suddenly, we're wide open, and all these things can kind of rush to the surface, and it can be, for some people, overwhelming if they're carrying a lot of pain, or a lot of, it's often pain that brings people to this practice. So in a way, you could say, it's even more of an issue because of what the kinds of expectations that people bring to the practice, that it's going to heal them or fix them. And I think it does actually provide a deep path of healing, but I'm quite sure that healing, it has to happen relationally, with other people, with competent mentors and a network of support, and that it can take years and decades of really engaging in the process, and pulling in other resources like psychotherapeutic resources or economic resources. It's not just that mindfulness can do all of that.
Yeah, and I think for the people out there who don't know this, many, if not all, of the major meditation retreat centers, I think one, they're all aware of this, definitely.
Oh yeah,
many, if not all of them, have medical doctors on site or relationships with them, and are now familiar with using a variety of
yes,
ways of interacting with people. Because of what you said. And, I often wonder whether part of this, when you said it's relational, if this is a function of the fact that mindfulness is now taught from teachers who don't have an ongoing relationship with
yes,
students. Someone might attend a silent retreat for a week at a
yes.
place they've never been to before with people they don't know, very different than traditionally when you would be living near your teacher. They'd be part of your community. You'd have ongoing interactions with them and with other people. This is a very different situation in the modern world. Maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's exactly what you're saying. I mean, it's not that all traditional cultures had that. Like in Tibet, people would go meet their teacher, get instructions, go into a cave for a year, and then, at some point come back,
Right.
find their teacher was dead, and go find another one. But for the most part, like the early contemplative communities were often monastic. They often lived together, like in the Zen tradition in China and Japan. People were living at monasteries together, and it was a way of life. It wasn't a lifestyle, and so that's obviously changed with modernity. Is people have become more individually focused and less communal. We all kind of have our own separate dwellings, and we really value our autonomy and our agency, and we don't necessarily want to get entangled sometimes in some of the challenges of community for very good reasons, because
Yes.
there's all sorts of issues that come up with working with teachers, especially in a kind of vertical relationship, where there's power differentials. And yet that's can be the most useful thing, is to find people that one can trust, both peers and teachers and mentors and guides, to be able to move through this stuff, because it's just so hard to trust our own mind sometimes, when it's like we're kind of losing touch a little bit
Yes.
with our previous realities.
I wonder if you could talk, as I started out saying at the beginning of the conversation, you've been doing this for a long time. I know that you and others at Buddhist Geeks have experimented with different ways of engaging people in meditation with each other through the internet.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could share, if I could use the words successes and failures, what things have worked, what haven't, and why, and what are the lessons, what are the lessons that you've learned, and, what are you doing now that maybe integrates those learnings?
Yeah, well, I mean, so I'll talk about the failures first.
Sure.
As you said, part of the goal of Buddhist Geeks has been to try to create community online that sort of meets some of those needs that we're talking about. Like, how do you have ongoing relationships with people that really can support you when shit gets hard, and really support you when you're exploring, deep territory of heart and body and mind, and how to do that at a distance, without living in the same community physically, and um, and also how to work with the challenges of power, and differentials in power between teachers and students, etc., and the way that can be abused and misunderstood. And part of the failure that we've had in the early part of doing this, my wife Emily and I, particularly as young teachers, who are just really coming into our own as teachers and doing these experiments, is that we initially gave too much of our authority away. We distributed or decentralized the authority prematurely, and created this sort of very peer-based network in the Buddhist Geeks community that while it had some really amazing people and some of the stuff that came out of it was really beautiful, we had no way really of tracking and knowing what was going on for folks. And, after the fact, after we pivoted away from that model, we then came to learn that there was some stuff happening that, we wouldn't have been comfortable with. People, stepping into the vacuum of power and asserting their own opinions when they may or may not have been useful. So that was the first mistake we made, is just kind of sensing that we needed to do things differently, but not doing it from a place where we really trusted and knew our own authority as teachers yet. And then, as we've our current approach as teachers, both my wife and I, is to stand in our seat. To stand in your seat. That's a great way to think about it. And to trust what we do know, while also really aiming to empower others to become their own wisdom holders and to own their own authority, and to try to create, new kinds of community or new ways of relating to each other in terms of our roles and accountabilities. That's a little bit more distributed. That's a little bit more. It is decentralizing in that direction, because one of the problems with traditional Buddhism is the way that the teacher, the guru, becomes this sort of this thing that we project all of our ideals onto. And if you're in that role as a teacher and everyone's projecting their ideals onto you, it's terrible.
Right.
It's terrible because, it's like you start, I start to believe that I should be perfect in some way, or that I should be like not feeling angry or not, it's like, oh, after this many decades of practice, I'm still getting pissed when my wife, leaves the, whatever, dishes out or whatever. And it's like, and I start to, as a teacher, one can start to really, to start acting in a way that isn't in accord with who they actually are. And they can no longer be a student themselves, and no longer be vulnerable, and no longer, share their humanity, which is really is a profound teaching itself. So I'm really curious about structures and ways of practicing. And I'd say this is one of the biggest successes we've had, is really focusing and emphasizing social meditation practice, meditation that's done with others out loud. And I'd be happy to demonstrate it if you want to do a minute or two of social practice.
Sure. I was going to ask you if you could give an example of it so people could understand what that means. I'd be glad to do it with you.
Yeah, it's easy. It's easiest to demonstrate it instead of talking about it. So one of the first practices I teach people is a practice called social noting. And this was a practice that was developed by one of my teachers and friends, Kenneth Folk. And Kenneth took this technique from the Burmese tradition. It's called noting meditation, typically. And it's usually done silently. So like in one's own mind, one would start to notice what their experience is, and then start to note, to use a verbal label to identify what's arising moment by moment in real time. And that was my first practice. I did that practice exclusively almost for about 4 years, including, in 4 months of silent retreat. So I did a lot of it, and I found it really helpful. What he discovered is that if you do it out loud with another person, and he was doing this as a teacher, that it actually ends up becoming easier to teach the method, because suddenly as the teacher, you can hear how the student is practicing. You can hear how they're noticing what their experience is, what kind of words they're using, where they're struggling, where they're not actually noticing the sensations, but just kind of making up stories about them and then saying that out loud. And then the other thing he realized in teaching it this way and going back and forth and noting out loud together is that the student could hear how he was modeling the practice, could get the benefits of the thousands and thousands of hours of practice, and actually hearing how the meditation worked out loud. The third benefit, and this was, I think, unexpected, is that by doing it out loud and doing it with other people, whether it's one person or a group of people, that suddenly attention starts to become directed toward the interpersonal aspect of experience, or the ways that each other's experience impacts my experience and my experience impacts others. And that's a domain of awareness, interpersonal awareness, social awareness, that solo meditation doesn't often bring so clearly. And so people can be really awake and clear and open in their own experience, and then, have an interpersonal reaction and suddenly feel, they lose all of it.
Right.
And so that was the third thing that kind of he realized in teaching this. So I continue to teach this, and one of the easiest ways to do social noting is to start with a variation of it called "There is social noting," and the basic instruction is just to start with the words "there is," and then to use a simple note or label to describe what it is that you're sensing in this moment. So it would look something like this if I were just to model it myself. There is sitting. There's breathing. There's thinking. There is relaxing. There is anticipating. There is not knowing. Okay, and then if we were to do it socially, then we would just ping pong back and forth. So I would start. There's seeing.
There is hearing.
There's hearing.
There is tension.
There is empathy.
There is seeing.
There is planning.
There is thinking.
There's feeling.
There is seeing.
There's breathing.
There is anticipating.
There is anxiety.
There is calmness.
There is allowing.
There is breathing.
There is gratitude.
There is seeing.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's interesting. I've done that before, but only in person. So it's very interesting to do it online with someone who I'm not physically present with. It has a different tone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and usually when I lead these kind of exercises, it's online and with video, so you do get a little bit more dimensionality, which is nice.
Well, that's great. I'm glad we did it, and that people could get a taste of it, even if by not doing it themselves. Where can people participate in this or other forms of social meditation through Buddhist Geeks now?
Yeah, so I am leading a training called Pragmatic Dharma training, and that's a Buddhist Geeks project. It's at pragmaticdharma.training. It's actually pretty limited. It's only about 50 participants, and it's, I'd say, close to full at the moment. So it may be that's not going to be the best avenue for a lot of people. But I've got other folks that are also leading trainings through Buddhist Geeks and doing social practice. So I'd say just maybe check out BuddhistGeeks.org and see what's out there, see what's available. My wife and I also teach retreats together, doing different lengths of retreat, and always welcome people that are wanting to explore social practice and silent practice and the combination of those. So that's also part of what we do.
That's great. And this may open up a whole other can of worms that we could probably talk about for a very long time. But when you mentioned that this group meditation online is limited to 50 people,
yes,
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what went into a decision like that,
yes,
a decision to do it live rather than pre-recorded, or what is ever popular now, an app.
Yeah.
There's so many modalities you can choose now and design online. I wonder what went into your thinking about the particular ways in which you're doing this now. online?
Yeah, well, so I'll describe the design of this training, and then I can talk about why why we design it this way. So the pragmatic dharma training, it's limited to 50 people because it involves a lot. So every participant I'm meeting with monthly, privately, for like a half an hour, or every other month for an hour, and we're actually having like a private conversation about their practice. um, that is a really powerful way to catalyze practice, to be able to do one-on-one work with someone. As I'm sure I'm sure you've had worked with someone one-on-one before, whether it's a therapist or a meditation teacher. It's really powerful.
Yes.
And then the other part of the training is a weekly group meeting with a very small group of people, a dozen or less folks. And in that group, which I facilitate, we do social practice together. We check in about how our week has been. We open it up for discussion to just see what people want to explore and talk about. And so, there's only so much time one can do that because it's very high touch. It's very relational. And the reason that it's designed that way is that I've found that those elements of both a one-on-one relationship with teacher or mentor and having a small group of people to train with and to start to get to know and have real relationships with peers, that those two things seem to be really necessary to help catalyze the type of deepening that I'm interested in as a teacher and that I went through as a student. And that without those things, it can be really hard to DIY it.
Mm.
And so, the way I think about it is like, I want to offer trainings that are for people who are independent in their practice. They're doing their own thing, but want to do that interdependently, with others. And so, part of it too for me is like, I don't tell people what they should be practicing or tell them, I know all these practices, but I don't presume to know what they need all the time. Even if I give feedback and see things I think might be useful, like ultimately, it's the practitioner, it's the person that's got to decide how to practice and how to get to know their own mind and to trust their own intuition and instincts. So that's the reason. And, for me, I see the apps and things like that. It's like we have an app, I'm not, I think there's usefulness in having apps because it introduces people to practice, and it's a resource. It's a training resource that can be really helpful. Um, so long to me as it leads, or can lead, or it gives a pathway to lead to something
Mm.
deeper that can work for people.
That's great. I mean, I certainly know meditation teachers who uh, either only teach in person or have been resistant to teaching online, and I can definitely understand
Mm-hmm.
the feeling of the true value of physical in person social meditation and guidance and teaching. Uh, at the same time, I've experienced the value of doing it online. I know some people
Yes.
who feel like they'll do it online if it doesn't detract from uh, the I don't want to just say transmission of knowledge, but I actually want to push further and say, are there any ways in which meditating online remotely can't just, let's say, retain some of the features of in-person meditation? Are there any ways in which you found it can enhance the experience or have benefits that
Yes.
in-person doesn't?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Because it's sometimes the case, and I've been part of many of these communities and trying to build these kind of communities, that online communities or online, in the Buddhist terminology, online sanghas, communities of practice, are affinity based. People are there because there's something that they all have an affinity for that can be very specific, like pragmatic dharma. That's like a specific
Mm-hmm.
way of approaching meditation and mind training and living. It's rooted in these very specific lineages and these very specific philosophies. If I were to start a pragmatic dharma thing in my local city, it's like maybe 2 people would show up.
Right.
But online, 100 people show up. And so there's something amazing about a group of people who have a shared affinity coming together to do something together. And I think in the past, pre-internet, that was only probably ever possible in major urban areas where there were enough people that you could get that kind of affinity group together in person. And now it's like that can happen everywhere and anywhere online. And to me, that is really powerful, and it is really it's a special kind of community that is in many ways um, better for learning, a better environment for learning than if one were to just get together with other people in person but not have a shared affinity.
Yeah, it's for those people who are familiar with the term long tail.
Yeah.
This is the term, right? Originally in marketing, I think, for when it became profitable to market super niche products, books that only maybe 300 or 400 people would buy, which would never have made sense to sell in Barnes and Noble when that company still existed because the market wasn't big enough. And yeah, the positive side of that long tail is that it helps the people who are, let's say, whose interests are not as common or maybe not as mainstream to actually find each other and interact with each other in a way that, as you said, would have either been impossible or just prohibitively expensive.
Yes.
Certainly pre-internet, people might travel to a conference once a year with people who are like them if they were, had an unusual interest. But what you're talking about allows people to do it regularly.
Yeah, and I think that's really powerful. And I'm glad you brought up the long tail, because I was reading recently an article that kind of pointed out that in many ways the long tail, say of book sales or of other things, has been now completely dominated by single corporations like Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one thing that I think is maybe worth thinking about, for the future of mindfulness and online and technology is, what kinds of platforms are going to arise that could enable these affinity groups? And let's maybe be a little bit more wary of what's driving these platforms before we kind of adopt them wholesale. Because, and this is one of my current kind of critiques of modern mindfulness, which is that there's this underlying economic operating system running underneath it that we often aren't critical enough of. And that's kind of digitally fueled capitalism in our case. And, I think the platform makers shape the experience of the users on the platform in profound ways that are often invisible. And now, we're seeing that with social media and Facebook and Twitter, and that the backlash of that's starting to hit us in terms of our governance. And I think the same thing is true, of mindfulness, meditation, and dharma practice. All these things, like, we've got to really think about also the platforms that we're using, and really, I think for me, like as an independent teacher, I want to protect that independence so that the platforms I use and the way I structure these trainings are in alignment with the deeper intention and the heart behind them. And I don't see most of modern capitalism and most of these platforms being in alignment with what I've learned from practicing.
It's very interesting. You think about two different models of, let's call it, aggregating services or production. You've got a company that might vertically integrate and become huge. I think that's what you're talking about, is like the risk of maybe mindfulness going in the Amazon direction.
Yeah, I mean, you could say Headspace is already moving in that direction.
Right, and I've been thinking there are other models, and sometimes they lose their original intent. But in the organic food industry, or even in coffee, there are companies that really make they make an effort to grow big by becoming, let's say, a collective or an aggregator of small cottage industry companies that allow those individual members to retain their individuality and their smallness, but get the benefit of being part of a collective. And that I don't know if you're thinking that's one direction that mindfulness could go in, to enable the Buddhist Geeks and Technology for Mindfulnesses of the world to pool together to get some of the exposure and visibility, but without becoming Walmart.
Yeah, I think so. I think so, and I think that is the direction that I hope that things move. More cooperative, collaborative. I see some promising trends in say like the the cryptocurrency space. I mean, I see a lot of crazy shit there too.
Right. Yes.
But that was a space that I got into, almost from the very beginning because of the potential of programming our own economic systems or programming our own governance systems and decentralizing some of the trust, distributing the trust through the network and programming it. That's something about that I think could be promising. Early on, I had this thought experiment of like, what would Buddha coin look like? What would an economy that was based on generosity and the principles of generosity, how would that be structured? What would the code look like? So to me, yeah, those kind of open experimental models that are actually, trying to break away from capitalism a little bit and offer alternatives, because that's what, the history of Buddhism is a history of a very alternative way of looking at things. I mean, early Buddhist history, I think it's hard to realize how profound this is now, but I mean, it was a break from the Indian caste system. It was a break from like the God determined, order of society. And also in the early Buddhist tradition, women were eventually invited in. It was the Buddha's, according to the legend, it was the Buddha's attendant, Ananda, who encouraged him to let women in because they had equal potential for awakening. And that also was profound in that culture at that time. And so, I think it's something about the realization that comes from investigating the heart and opening and clearly seeing, what this human life is like, and where we suffer and where we hurt each other, and gaining wisdom into that actually can enable one to think differently about society and how we structure things on a social and systemic level. And so I hope that, deep meditators and deep practitioners, people that get into this stuff through modern means, go deep enough to start to question how it is that we've structured our very society and start to rethink and redesign and offer alternatives to that.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, it sounds like the hope is that what Buddhist Geeks is doing will help people transform in a way that would help Buddhist Geeks and other organizations like it grow and become more sustainable at what they're doing.
Yeah, and in a different way, in a way that's generosity powered, as opposed to, kind of continuing to do some of the things, like using the tactics and strategies that, just taste bad. It's just like at the end of the day, it's like, okay, like I'm getting results, but damn, that doesn't feel good to like use artificial scarcity to encourage someone to take an action. When I said earlier that there's like not that many spaces filled, it's not because I want you to be interested in it. It's because it's actually true.
Right.
And I think part of the reason it's true is because, like we're part of what we're doing with these new trainings is we're using a transparent generosity economic model, which is a new thing. We're sort of giving people data about how much we think we need for this program to work, what the average is that people are actually giving, and then what the range is. And then we're saying, hey, it's up to you. Like it's up to you how much you want to give and what you can give, given your exchange rate compared to the US dollar, given your current economic situation, given whatever. And like, to me, I've seen such a profound response to that model. And that's been part of my own personal experimenting. Like, what can I do to move things in the more generosity direction? And I think that's part of the reason that it actually is popular.
That's really great. I mean, I'd encourage anyone who is interested in that. I know people in all walks of life have been working on in their own ways, experimenting with these different economic models. And as much as we criticize the internet for helping mega corporations grow, it's also been a really fertile ground for all of this other kind of experimentation as well.
Yeah, I think as long as we can maintain some net neutrality, then we should be able to continue experimenting, exploring. Yeah.
Great. Well, I've really enjoyed talking to you, Vincent.
Likewise.
I'm sure we could keep talking forever, but
I doubt
that. Thanks so much for joining me on the Technology for Mindfulness podcast. Bye now.
Thank you, Robert.
Thanks for joining us for this Technology for Mindfulness podcast with me, Robert Plotkin, and today's guest, Vincent Horn, a meditation teacher and co-founder of Buddhist Geeks. Vincent is currently running a pragmatic dharma training program for people who want to accelerate their personal and social awakening. If you liked today's episode, please leave us a review on iTunes and share the episode with your friends. Those and all other links are in the show notes. And check out our blog at technologyformindfulness.com for information and tips about science, technology, and mindfulness. And find out about our Tap Into Mindfulness course for helping you to take control of your smartphone at tapintomindfulness.com. I'm Robert Plotkin, and I'll join you next time on the Technology for Mindfulness podcast when we'll welcome back author and independent filmmaker John DeGraff, this time to talk about mindfulness, environmentalism, and beauty.